Hello, Rustaceans! Welcome to another episode of This Week in Rust here on the Rustacean Station. As always, I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington, lead editor of This Week in Rust. This episode covers issue number 352 of This Week in Rust, published on August 18th, 2020. After going through this week's news, we will continue our interview series with speakers from the upcoming RustConf. This week we will hear from Harrison Bachrach, Esteban Kuber, and Jam. Each speaker will introduce themselves and give you a brief preview of their talk at the end of this episode. Before we go into the news, however, I'd like to start off today's podcast with a personal note. I am one of the 250 Mozillians who were laid off last week. While this was a shock, I have been deeply touched by the outpouring of support from the Rust community. This Week in Rust, the newsletter, will definitely be continuing. However, this podcast will be taking a break at least for a few weeks. This is to give me some time to process this unexpected change in my life and to consider where I'd like my next role to be. I have greatly enjoyed recording this podcast, and depending on where I land, I hope to return to it in the future. Thank you again for all of your outreach and support. I cannot even begin to express how touching it has been and how deeply grateful I am. Truly, we are an incredible group of people. Now, let's start with the news. The core team has released a new blog post titled Laying the Foundation for Rust's Future. This post addresses some of the uncertainty and confusion in the Rust community after the Mozilla layoffs. It reassures the community that the Rust project will indeed continue. Additionally, it announces plans for establishing a Rust Foundation, something I worked on while working at Mozilla, and I am thrilled that I can finally talk about. A working group, including members of the core team and a few others, including myself, will be working together to have the first iteration of the foundation up and running by the end of the year. I can't wait to see something that has been planned for so long finally come together. Ferris Systems has published another post in their Learning Rust series. This one is called The Compiler is Your Friend, and covers how you can use the Rust compiler as your personal mentor when learning core Rust concepts. I highly recommend it. Have you found yourself wondering about using Rust to write embedded software? Hank Dieter's post, Why Rust is a Great Fit for Embedded Software, is a great place to start. Learn the basics of Rust on embedded systems and, in particular, useful crates for your embedded systems. Dieter will also teach you how to set up your development environment and create your first embedded program that will cause an LED light to blink. Jam, whom you will hear an interview with later in this podcast, has written a post called Why Rust Unsafe Works. If you have spent much time in the Rust community, you may have heard someone say something along the lines of, well, sure, Rust is safe, but unsafe exists and most of the standard library is unsafe. Read the post to see how Jam debunks this view through discussing encapsulations and locality and how they work together. Amos is back with a great post on the Faster Than Lime blog. This one discusses the process of learning Rust from the viewpoint of a Java, C#, C, or C++ developer. If your friends developing in those languages have questions about Rust, this post is a great one to send them. If you are in the mood for a deep dive into async programming, definitely check out Kirill Dubovikov's post called Async Unicorns Love Rust. Learn the why and the how of async programming with Rust, and even if you feel you already know how to program asynchronously, it's always good to review the concepts from another point of view. Ryan Gorup, founder of Ebflow, is back with another post about building Linux packages for Rust, in particular building them with GitHub Actions using custom actions and Docker container images. Check out the post for all of the information about building and hosting your build images, creating GitHub Actions workflows, and more. Moving on to RFCs, it's been a quiet week for Rust RFCs this week. No RFCs were approved, no RFCs are in final comment period, and no new RFCs were proposed. That means this week is a great opportunity to catch up with the RFCs currently in progress. Make sure to check out the Rust RFC GitHub repo linked in the show notes. As for upcoming events, the biggest one on my mind is RustConf, which comes to your screens this Thursday, August 20th. I'm thrilled to be hosting it, and I hope the interviews with the speakers you've heard over the past few weeks have helped you get excited about it as well. I can tell you firsthand how incredibly hard each of the speakers worked on their talks. They each did at least one run-through with me, many did 2, and a few even did 3 before finalizing their talk. I can't wait for you to see their work. As for other events, we have an online meetup coming up in Vancouver, BC, and in-person meetups in Dallas, Texas, and Seoul, South Korea. And now let's move on to our final RustConf speaker interviews. This week we hear from Harrison Bachrach, Esteban Kuber, and Jam. First, let's talk to Harrison Bachrach. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm Harrison Bachrach. So I'm a software engineer at a company called DocSend. I came out of school originally mostly studying physics, but then transitioned into software engineering when I realized that research was not for me. I was in a bunch of different labs and realizing that a lot of my work would have a really, really limited audience and not affect a lot of people for a really, really long amount of time was a little bit demoralizing. And software engineering, you can make a big impact very, very quickly. So I've been doing this for a little over 3 years now. And I mostly do web dev stuff. So I'm primarily a Rails developer, but I focus a lot on the front end. So I'm really interested in tools like Elm, React. I think those are probably the main two. That's sort of like my stuff. I also, as you'll see in the talk, I like baking and cooking a lot. So I make a lot of challah in my spare time.
And if this were an in-person conference, I'd say, please, can you bring challah to the conference with you? It's one of my favorite breads.
It's really great. It's also like it's pretty hard to screw up compared to like sourdough, which I know a lot of people are getting into right now. I've tried making sourdough and I'm like, this is way too hard. I just want to go back to challah.
Awesome. What's the topic of your talk?
So the talk is, I think this is the final title I ended up going with. It's like how to start a solo project that you'll stick with. So I've started and stopped many, many solo projects, and it's really, really both hard to sort of give up all the times, but it's just like really demoralizing. So recently I was able to pick up a project and stick with it for a great deal more time and actually got it into a state that I'm proud of. And I wanted to share how I did that and how other people can do that too.
Awesome. And what drew you to this topic?
Yeah. So, it like really, really sucks to start a lot of side projects. I feel like in today's sort of like hyper online state, people feel a lot of pressure to work on side projects. And, I don't think that pressure is necessarily a good thing, but I think there are a lot of people who are just intrigued about the opportunity of doing that. And I think it's also a great way to just learn. For me, learning is kind of like a thing I do. I try to do all the time. It's like a big part of my life and something that I really enjoy. And a side project is often a really good vehicle for that. So yeah, I mean, I think if I can encourage other people to, succeed in that way, I'd be really, really happy.
Great. And what can our audience look forward to about your talk?
Really, really bad jokes, really good pictures of bread. I need to add more pictures of bread. And hopefully some really useful tips on how to sort of work on side projects. In addition to, both inside of software engineering as well as outside. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about applies pretty much to anything, whether it's like if you want to get into fitness stuff or you want to do other hobbies that you've been wanting to get into but have been struggling to push yourself into. It kind of is universally applicable stuff.
Sounds great. Well, I am looking forward to your talk. I know a lot of us are starting side projects now, as you mentioned, because a lot of us are inside a lot more of the time. And I'm sure it's going to be really useful both to my Rust work and my work outside of Rust.
I hope so.
All right. We'll see you there.
All right. Thanks so much.
Now let's hear from Esteban Kuber. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Hi, I'm Esteban Kuber. I'm a software engineer at TWiR, a company making better software for doctors. And I'm also a member of the Rust compiler team. I focus a lot on the ergonomics of the language, but my main focus for the past couple of years has been on diagnostics and making sure that the compiler is as helpful as it can be. I acknowledge that we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm very proud at the current state of the compiler's UX.
Well, as someone, and I imagine most of our listeners also use your work daily, thank you. The really helpful error messages in ergonomics made my journey toward learning Rust so much better, and that journey never ends. So it's continuing to help me. So thank you for that work.
I'm really glad to hear. I appreciate it, and yeah, that's what I strive for. Making sure that Rust is as easy to learn as possible, even when we can't really change the language. I think it's incredibly important.
And what's the topic of your talk for RustConf?
Well, funnily enough, it's very related to this. I'm trying to lay the argument that we can make Rust easier to learn beyond modifying the language itself and making the documentation and associated tooling much easier to use, particularly when you're coming from other languages. A lot of the talk is showing the evidence or making the argument of what the current state of both the Rust ecosystem and the industry in general is, and trying to argue for one, why it is important to change, and two, what we can do to improve the situation. The actual talk is slightly different to what to the original outline that I sent. I hope everyone involved in RustConf is not too mad about it. Yeah, as I was expanding the outline, I realized that there was a lot of things that could be said, and it was way more general than just Rust. I think that what we are doing is important for the Rust community, but I also think it's very important as a way to set an example for the rest of the ecosystem beyond the language. And I'm not claiming in any way, shape, or form to be the first or even the best out there doing this, but I do think that we are setting a good example.
Great. Well, as someone who has seen the run-throughs of your talk, I don't think our audience is going to be disappointed at all.
I'm really glad to hear.
And what drew you to this topic?
There's a lot of work that has been poured into the compiler to make it as friendly as it is. And I'm really glad whenever I see either on Twitter or in some blog post, people gushing over the diagnostic messages and the error reporting. I'm really glad to see that. But beyond that external feedback, we as a team, we don't really talk too much about it, about what goes into it and why we think it is important and how we reached our current situation. That is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it. Two is also something that I'm intimately familiar with. I've been working on this space for 5 years now. My first few contributions to the compiler were tweaking some diagnostic errors that I remember I started contributing precisely because I tried to pick up Rust. The documentation made a lot of sense, but when I tried to apply the concepts, it was much harder and I was hitting brick walls. And I don't remember what error it was, but I remember the situation. I wrote this small piece of code and I saw an error that I could not understand. And after half an hour, I finally figured it out. And I didn't feel bad because I didn't get it at first. I didn't feel smart because I finally understood it. I felt slightly angry and disappointed at the compiler because it seemed, in my mental model, the compiler knew what the problem was and it wasn't telling me. And yeah, that actually is how I started contributing to the compiler, and I realized there were so many things that we could be doing to improve that experience. And yeah, it's been after so many years, it's been really rewarding to see how much, one, how far we've gotten, and two, I'm really excited about the future, how many things are coming down the pipeline that are going to improve the situation. And again, I do not want to claim that I'm the only one working on this. There are tons of people that have contributed to the compiler over time. I built on top of things that were already there, and other people are helping me get it to the next stage.
Sounds great. And what can our audience look forward to about your talk?
I struggle to answer that question.
Fair point.
I hope that people leave my talk invigorated and looking at their tools in a different way. I also hope that people will come out of it with a renewed desire to use good tooling. I want people to demand more from their tools. I want people to not feel as frustrated as they do. Relatively recently, I was teaching somebody Python, and I realized how obtuse some of the tooling and the errors that people see are, and we just develop this tunnel vision and we forget what it looks like to somebody with fresh eyes. And I really hope that I really hope that with my talk, people will be convinced that we need to build these onboarding ramps for people coming from outside our language and outside our ecosystem and outside our industry, so that they can also be part of this industry that everybody that is in it, for one reason or another, we love it so much.
Well, that's a great call to action, and I am looking forward to seeing your talk at RustConf. Thank you so much, Esteban.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
And finally, let's hear from Jam. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jam. I do security research. I have like a really soft spot for embedded security, and I got started in Rust about 2 years ago and just kind of fell in love with it and have been using it for basically everything.
Awesome. What's the topic of your talk?
My talk is, well, it's called Macros for a More Productive Rust. And the general idea is like familiarization with macros, like what can they do? You know, how might you use them? What libraries do I need to learn? You know, stuff like that. Just trying to get like the audience familiar with the feeling of writing macros and hopefully like get them to dig deeper.
Awesome. I know, I'm not a new Rust developer, but I've been using it for a few years. Macros still make my head hurt. So I'm really looking forward to watching your talk, and hopefully it'll make it a little less headachy for me and a little less headachy for other people too.
Hopefully.
And what drew you to this topic?
Well, I was working on a project for work about a year ago, and I found myself writing a lot of repetitive boilerplate. And so I was like, there must be a better way, like, grayed out commercial style. And so I started digging into like Rust metaprogramming in general. And, like 3 weeks after that, I had like spent, like every day just like grinding at macros until I had this monstrous 1,000-something line macro that kind of made like a language within a language to make it so that I don't have to write any of the boilerplate. And I've kind of just been like super fascinated with like creative uses of macros in general since.
Fantastic. And you kind of already answered this, but what can our audience look forward to about your talk?
Hopefully everyone can learn something about macros, even if it's just, like one of those insights where it's like, oh yeah, I've never thought of it that way. And just, maybe having more of a appreciation for Rust, or just like another tool in your tool belt.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Jam. I am really looking forward to your talk and looking forward to seeing everyone at RustConf.
I'm absolutely excited for it as well.
As a reminder, RustConf registration is open, and I hope to see you all there. And that's all for this week's podcast. Make sure to check out the full issue of This Week in Rust for even more fantastic Rust content. This Week in Rust is edited by myself, Andre Bogus, and Colton Donnelly. This week's contributors included, using their GitHub usernames, Jam1Garner, Darksun, HDOORDT, Gorup, Ecstatic Morse, and Humble. As always, if you write a great article on Rust or happen to see one, please submit it to This Week in Rust by opening a pull request on our GitHub repo. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and please stay safe out there.